absent in the sense that it's not a relevant alternative to whatever is considered relevant reality. So it's never considered a relevant reality. So what the abyssal thinking is at the core is the idea of the impossibility of the co-presence of the two sides of the line. This side of the line and the other side of the line. That's here in a graphic you'll see how I'm going to develop my argument, and now we can move on there. So this is the abyssal line. This is this side of the line, the earth side, and this is the other side of the line, the dam side of the line. And if you look at this, the idea is that whatever lies outside, and we are going to see these examples, in fact disappears as reality, vanishes. I have an article which I don't assign to you. It's called The Knowledge of Blindness. The idea that our lenses of theoretical concepts are like laser beams. They allow us to see with great precision certain parts of reality, but they leave everything out that is not based, focused by the beam, and that creates what I call this knowledge of blindness. Let's say, for instance, my own work. This is a kind of a piece of self-criticism on my own work. I have been characterizing, in the line of others, that Western modernity is based on this tension between social regulation and social emancipation. You know, social regulation and social emancipation. Regulation, as you know, is, you can find that both in Marx, both in Max Weber. They are the principles of the state, the market, and community. I mean, the idea that modern regulation is based on these three principles, and emancipation is the process of rationality, which, according to Weber and then Habermas, is in fact the instrumental cognitive rationality, the aesthetic expressive rationality, and the moral practical rationality. So we have this tension, which, as I said, we have that in the 19th century, the positivists very well, when there's someone from Brazil, order and progress. I mean, the two belong to each other is precisely what it is the tension between regulation and emancipation. For a long time, and you see that in ordinary common sense, I said, well, this is characteristic of the Western modernity. And I took this characteristic as a universal characteristic of Western modernity. But later on, I came to see, so don't blame yourself sometimes if you are not satisfied with your frameworks, because we are moving, you are very dynamic, so we move from one pattern to another one. So in my case, and I'm explaining to you my case, I suddenly came to the conclusion that this universality is really fake. Because all this regulation emancipation, as it was developed, particularly from the 18th century onwards, in fact, only took place in the metropolitan societies, not in the colonies. After all, the world was basically colonies at that time. And they were, most of the populations were in colonies at the end of the 19th century, for instance. But these concepts did not apply to the colonies. They applied just to the metropolitan societies. And this idea of regulation emancipation would be unthinkable to be applied to the colonies. Could not be applied to the colonies. And therefore, the fact that it was not applied did not compromise their universality. Because it was unthinkable. Because on the other side of the line, in the colonies, another paradigm dominated, was the paradigm appropriation violence. This was the paradigm of regulation, so to say. It had nothing to do with emancipation. It had to do with appropriation and violence. How we appropriate people, as slaves, as forced labor, as cultures. After all, who discovered the maritime way to India, Vasco da Gama or the Swahili Muslim pilot that guided the boats? So you are using local knowledges, you appropriate local knowledges in order to produce the advanced knowledge. But in this area, in fact, you don't see regulation emancipation. You see appropriation and violence. And the idea is that these two realms have never been able to be co-present in our theories. We never consider that, and that's why it is so easy for us to transform this reality into a universal reality, because we don't consider that. Give you an example. 19th century, at the end of 19th century, all of us are very proud of the fact that it was a moment in which labor law developed as a kind of a social field. And it's very important. In fact, there was not a progressive that did that, was Bismarck, with unemployment benefits and so on, because he was so much afraid of the revolutionaries that he really started what we call today the welfare state. And in fact, then the social democratic parts took that on their own agenda and developed a tremendous facilitated, protective field of social law, which is labor law. And this labor law is absolutely fundamental because in the modernity, in Western modernity, particularly in European modernity, because in fact it is to make real the equality between the two parties, because they know that there is no equality between an employer and an employee, real equality, and therefore the labor law is there to compensate for the real imbalances between the two. Was this the whole story? So labor law here developing. Was this the labor law? No. On this side, precisely at the same time, European governments were producing the legislation about forced labor. After the slavery, forced labor. And labor law in Africa was not part of protection, social protection, was penal law. So the same reality, labor, was on this side facilitative and protective, was on this side penal law, forced labor. The realities cannot be compared because it's absolutely a different reality. So is forced labor part of the Western theory of labor law or not? Of course, if I consider this side of the line, it is not. If I consider this, I have to know that in fact that part is absolutely necessary to understand that. And now you can understand, and why I claim the political economy, why Rosa Luxemburg becomes so important. Because Rosa Luxemburg, what she said, well, you can say, well, this is primitive accumulation, right? Well, for those that are familiar with the concept. And what does she say? Well, primitive accumulation is not a stage of capitalism. It's a constant of capitalism. Capitalism needs always the monotony of economic relations, as Marx used to say, and primitive accumulation, dispossession, as David Harvey today says he claims to be that. So we have this primitive accumulation together, and that's why today we have slave-like labor. Why the United Nations have a whole department dedicated to slave-like labor? And look at the cynical character of this slave-like. What is this? It's slavery. I would like to see the difference that it makes for a person subjected to slave-like labor. The idea is not just slavery, it's slave-like. But it doesn't make any difference. It's a euphemism, because Western modernity does not want to confront itself with the idea that slavery has been abolished. But it's brutal cynicism. If this was produced from the perspective of the people that have been subjected to and are subjected to slave labor, of course there is no slave life. It's growing in Brazil this time. Pará is a state in which we have really a real problem. We have even a department of the Attorney General fully dedicated to eradication of slave labor. So this is what you can see, how this abyssal thinking is going to dominate. But then, this line, in fact this line, it was a real line in the beginning. And in 14-something, this line was the Tordesillas line that divided the world between the old world and the new world. In fact, at that time were the Portuguese and the Spanish, right? That was the treaty. And it's very interesting to note that whatever is valid on this side of the line is not valid here. It's very clear. I mean, if you look and in the paper I bring the citations of international law, how it is important for the international law at the beginning of the 16th century, 17th century, to distinguish between this and that, because the international law His valid here is not valid over there. For instance, the Catholic kings of Spain and France enter a treaty, a peace treaty, that of course is very, very valid here. But then the French kings can side with the pirates that were attacking the Spanish boats on this other side of the line, because this was outside the law. Pascal, beyond the equator there are no seas. You see, this was a no man's land in a sense. Terran reefs, this is going to be called later on. So there was no, the universality of international law was not questioned, because it would be unthinkable to apply it to here. You see? Without any contradiction. And that's why I think that we have to understand at this point how this line developed. And now you understand that precisely this line, which also is the colonial and the metropolitan, is very much at the core of liberal theory of modernity. Look at Hobbes. Look at Locke. Where is the state of nature? In the Americas, they say. Both of them, they say, here is the state of nature. And here is civil society. So what sense does it make for us to say that in Western modernity the social contract makes this tremendous, fabulous advancement of abandoning the state of nature and build a civil society? Yes, we did that here, but we didn't do that over here. And in fact, if you take this decentred view, because of course what I'm inviting you is an effort of decentering from the Western tradition, which of course is not easy. It's not been easy for me. I wouldn't think that it's easy for you. Is that in fact it is not the state of nature that is abundant to create the civil society, is the concomitant growth of civil society and state of nature. At the same time that we are developing civil society here, we are subjecting millions and millions of people to a new state of nature, which is colonial domination. So it is really wrong to say that in Western modernity we abandon the state of nature. No. We submitted millions of people to the state of nature. Then we'll sit to that if it is still today true. That's your question in your mind. We'll get there. Let's be a bit more precise. This line is in fact a cartography. It is interesting if you read the text of the 17th century to look at the care, the precision that is necessary, the instructions that are given to the globe makers, to the map makers, to the cartographers, to the pilots, not to design very precisely this line. This line was very, very precise, because this was the line, the abyssal line between what counted as civilization and what counted as the new world, the state of nature. So that's why it was so carefully done throughout this time. But this cartographical abyssal line is in fact two lines. It is an epistemological line and a legal line. And I'm going to tell you that on this side, the epistemological line is the following, is that we are going to grant to modern science, we already said something about that, in such a way that modern science has the monopoly of the truthful and the false, or the truth and falsehood. That is to say, truth and falsehood, the great criteria between true and false is determined according to the criteria that science establishes valid criteria. From 17th century onward, you know, this idea of true and false and what is really truth is very well debated. It is debated, for instance, as a visible distinction that also forces us to other distinctions between science, philosophy, and theology. Because there were other truths that were not ascertainable according to scientific methods. Because science, the truth in science, even assuming that there is such a thing, or just the quest for truth, not just truth, it's very relative, it's very partial, because only certain phenomena, according to certain conditions, following certain methods, can be considered to be true. Right? What about philosophy? There are competing conceptions of